Hello, everyone. Hopefully, we are now broadcasting live from the Isle of Raasay Distillery. I will say the next minute and a half, maybe some tech support if we are maybe not coming through to you guys clearly in audio or video. Please let us know in the chat functions. But we are here on what I think we all agree is a very warm Raasay day. The bright sunshine is radiating into here. I'm sure you all wish you were here with us right now. My name is Callum Gillis. I am head of content creation. I'm the distillery ambassador here at the Isle of Raasay Distillery. I'm joined by our co-founder, Alistair Day, and whiskey writer Dave Broom. And well, today is a really exciting day. It's the launch of our Isle of Raasay single malt. What we're going to be doing today is exploring our single malt, going into it in detail, and of course, going into the actual casks and recipe components that go into making up the single malt itself. Now, a bit of housekeeping up front. Over the course of the night, we are going to be talking about all these different elements. We are going to be covering everything from the history of the distillery to Raasay, to the way that we make our spirit. Dave's going to be offering his amazing insight on the whiskey and the different casks. Alistair on the process behind the distillery. I'll be contributing, I'm sure, plenty of other bits and pieces too. But if you have any questions, there are actually a couple of ways that you can put them into the chat. There is a chat function. Like a normal Zoom call, you can add in comments. We'd love to hear tasting notes of what you think of the different cask types and various things. If you've got any questions, you can feel free to put them in there. But you might also notice you also have a Q&A function. So you can actually ask us questions. They'll be submitted. We can browse through them. Some of them can be answered by the team who are in the chat tonight. There's Scott, William, and Ellen, and we can answer them live here as well. So we'll hopefully try and get through to as many of those as possible. I know there's a lot of you in right now, so we'll try and get to everybody, but it's going to be a really fun night. Hopefully we can cover everything. Now, the order of the drams, we'll post in the chat. So the team will put into the chat the order that we're going to be going through them. But we're going to start with the Isle of Raasay single malt. We're going to celebrate by opening it. I'm as excited as you guys for that moment. It's been a long time coming for this. And then what we're going to do is go through the cask samples. So we're going to start with the unpeated cask samples, and then we're going to finish the night with the peated cask samples. Now, remember, the cask samples are cask strength. They're anywhere from 56 to 60% alcohol. So be aware of that. Take your time with them. It's not a competition. We're not going to drink them all or finish them all tonight. What we're going to be doing is starting with the rye whiskey. We're then going to move on to the virgin Chinkapin oak, and then we're going to finish with the Bordeaux casks. And we're going to be doing that for both the unpeated and then the peated casks. So I think that was everything I wanted to get over with tonight. There's a few other things and fun things we're going to do. Alongside the questions, we've also got some polls. We'd really like to hear what you guys think and what your favorites are out of the night. So at the end of our unpeated and the end of our peated run, what we'll do is we'll actually maybe try and do a little poll, find out what people's favorites are, preferences, that kind of stuff. We'll try not to sway you too much. Peated rye is fantastic, but anyway, that's just an unrelated comment. So anyway, I've introduced myself. Like I say, I'm Callum. I think what I'll do is I'll let the other two introduce themselves, maybe just starting immediately to my right. So Alistair, would you like to introduce yourself fully?
Yes, I'm Alistair Day, co-founder of R&B Distillers and Isle of Raasay Distillery. And we're really excited this evening to be sharing our signature single malt with you. So our Hebridean single malt, really looking forward to it. I'm really excited to do that.
And I'm Dave Broom. I'm a whiskey writer, spirits writer for about the past 30 odd years. Started very young, obviously. And I've been in the really fortunate position of following Raasay pretty much since day one. Yeah. So tonight is just an absolutely fantastic occasion. Really looking forward to trying the drams, really looking forward to doing a deep dive into where all the flavors are coming from and just really celebrating this remarkable distillery on such a beautiful sunny night.
Very sunny. I will say that. if you know,
I'm not wearing shades.
There is a jug of water here that I'm going to be consuming. Watch to see how quickly I finish this jug of water over the course of the next hour. I think what Dave said there is a really good point that I want to touch on, is the fact that Dave's been up here now 4 times at really pivotal points in the distillery's process. You opened it, things like that. But I think what we'll do first is, I'm sure everyone's got plenty of drinks. Let's actually open it. Now, maybe Alistair, you'd like to lead this.
Absolutely. So here we go.
And everyone at home, if you've got your whiskey in front of you, you've got your single malt, I would encourage you now to also get out and actually pop the cork. Oh,
there you go.
I should have had the mic right up close to that. Oh, yes, thank you very much. So, Alistair, maybe you could tell us just when was this actually, how long has this now been in the bottle? Like, how new are we talking about having this just out on the shelves?
Well, literally, we're still bottling. So,
so there's your answer.
It's out in the shops. We've completed our ballot. We sent that out to our ballot winners, and it's gone to some of our customers. It's in the distillery shop here. But we are literally still bottling. So,
as the tired distillers out there will tell you. So we've got our drams. I think we should all do a toast. So I will say all the staff are currently out there right now watching and probably laughing at me, which absolutely fair. So they're all there toasting and enjoying it. I hope you all guys are all at home as well. So I think to the single malt slange.
Single malt slange.
So,
slange everybody.
Dave, you touched on that. You have been here now, day one, day two, or year one, year two, year three. Briefly, what do you think? What's it been like following this story and coming up, and getting to the point now where we actually have our single malt?
Yeah, it's been remarkable. It was the first distillery. You asked me to open the distillery. I've opened plenty of bottles, but I've never opened a distillery before or cut a ribbon. So it was an incredible honour to be here on the opening. And that day in itself, it was very similar to this, actually. A lovely, warm, sunny day, and the pipe band from Skye came across and everybody processed up. And it was a really emotional moment because the entire island had come out. And there was this feeling that it wasn't just the distillery, that it was actually something that was the start of something new, the start of a revival of the island. So, and it really got to me that. And I know we'll probably touch on this whole idea of whiskey and community, and the kind of the ripples that distillery causes throughout an island or a community. And it spoke to me more than it just being yet another fantastic new distillery. There was something deeper at work here. So to be able to come back up and have a look at the way in which the whiskey was maturing, and also the way in which your mind was working, as more and more layers of complexity, every time I came up, it's like, oh, we're also doing this, by the way, So it's what I loved was it was clearly never from the word go just going to be a linear, cookie cutter distillery. There was always going to be something important for the island. There's also going to be something important, I think, in general term, for whiskey itself. So it's awesome to actually find, this dram in front of me now.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. This has been a good moment, I think, to let it oxygenate and aerate slightly. I think it's good. We've opened the bottle, we've put it in the Glencairn glass. Maybe actually, I'm sure everyone has always wanted to ask Dave Broom exactly how you taste a Scotch whisky. So this is a really good opportunity, and I'm gonna be taking note of this. If anyone's watching and does a tour with me in the future, prepare to hear this verbatim. But we've just opened a bottle. A lot of this people are tasting this for the first time. How would you approach basically tasting this for the first time?
I would pour it. I'd let it sit for a while just in order to open it up. First thing to do, obviously bring it to the nose and do it quite gently, just in case, especially the cask strength, which we will be having later on, guys. So be aware for that. And just relax into it. I think that's the most important thing. But when I'm sort of talking, teaching people how to taste whiskey rather than drink whiskey. I don't teach people how to drink it. But,
that's an easy one to learn.
You quite often kind of tense up a little bit, and it's going, I'm desperate to try and find things, and you're kind of gazing into this whiskey. Just relax and let the whiskey come to you. And I always start off really quite simply, and I think, well, is it sweet? Is it dry? Is it light? Is it heavy? Is it smoky? Is it heavy smoke? Or is it light smoke? And just these really simple, points, these kind of frame that you begin to create.
What about yourself, Alistair? Have you got a way of approaching the whiskey when you first pour it like that?
Yeah, very, very similarly. We were at a tasting Sunday actually, and my daughter told me off for swilling the glass so much. I do tend to swill the glass. It has for a reason. I like to see the legs running down the side of the glass, and obviously it gives you the colour, but it opens it up as well. And when you go back to the nose, you get slightly more from it as well.
Yeah,
So.
definitely.
And the other thing about the legs, actually, is if we're already going way off. The other thing about the legs is that if you just have a look at the way in which the legs or the tiers or cathedral windows, whatever you want to call them, are trickling down the inside of the glass. If you think of the inside of the glass as being like the inside of your mouth, if they're moving quite slowly, the whiskey is actually going to be more physical and slower in the mouth as well. So it's the first wee clue. You're constantly picking up clues.
Yeah. So
it's not just what the flavour is, but why the flavour is there and what it means, and that it only comes with practice.
Yeah.
The only way you can learn about whiskey is to taste it, really. You can read as many books as you want, and great books are available. but
that later.
Not by Chapman the Plane, I hasten to add. But the only way that you're going to be learning about whiskey is to be there with friends, taste, and learn your own palate, learn what all the flavors mean.
Definitely, I think this will be a good experience for a lot of folks who are maybe this is a very unique experience if you're getting a chance to try the whiskey and then try those parts that have gone into it, and seeing what kind of parts are coming out. I mean, I'm sure a lot of folks maybe who haven't tried the cask samples yet, we've obviously all tried these in different ways in different years, but immediately, what to you guys, what's coming out at you when you are nosing and tasting this for the first time?
Well, when we set off and when Dave was opening the distillery and we started distilling, we very much wanted to have these black fruit, these dark fruits, black currants, black cherries, and we've designed the process, and we'll talk more about that later, but we designed the process to allow us to produce those sorts of flavors. So it's very pleasing for me that on the nose you do get those dark fruit flavors, and also maybe just a little bit of ripe apricot as well. And that's important for us at the distillery, because generally speaking, when you talk about fruit and whiskey, you're talking about apples, pears, bananas, very typical things. And this is something that we really wanted to explore and bring out these dark fruit characters. And if you're on the nose, if you're getting a bit black currant or black cherries, then I'm happy with that.
Yeah. Now, what about yourself, Dave? We've had a chance to nose it. Well, in a moment we will taste. We're teasing everyone with it, but we're letting it move around on the nose. And when your first impressions, I think it was actually Charles MacLean that says, the first impression, that very first nosing, is always the most important that you're going to get. What is your first impressions of this when you first get that nose?
The first impression really is how gentle and complex it is. And you often think there's great young whiskies out there, but and quite often they're a bit wee bit edgy. They're kind of adolescents, that they're youthful and boisterous. Shall we say? This has got real subtlety, real elegance to it already. So the dark fruits are quite definitely there, but the soft fruit, there's that tiny little touch of smoke coming through. But the thing that I really like about it is that those layers of complexities that are already beginning to be apparent, in a whiskey, this young, it really is great. And every time, one way to kind of measure complexity is, every time you bring the glass up to your nose, are you getting something new? And you are. All of a sudden, there's a little bit of kind of dry grass in there. There's a little bit of kind of pepperiness coming through. There's a kind of sweeter element coming in. So every time there seems to be, and not even seems to be, there is something new and fascinating about it. It really is. It's a great one to nose, but I think drinking is probably even better.
Hint, hint. On that note,
shall we?
Yes. In that case, I think again, Slange. Now, my first initial note is that bottle has definitely been warmed up by the sun.
It's room temperature.
A perfect room temperature draft. Very rare. We often do warehouse tastings, and that's often usually well below your kind of room temperature. But yeah, again, maybe Alistair, yourself, when we're talking about the initial taste, initial flavors, you mentioned that kind of dark fruit note. What other elements are you trying to layer into this?
I think for me up front, you're getting that black pepper, that kind of spice, and that's hanging with a little bit of the alcohol. It's 46.4 ABV, so you're getting a little bit of that alcohol in there as well, a bit of that black pepper, and then the smoke's just lingering, just kind of tingling on the tongue, and then in come those dark fruits, and the layers. You start to get these layers of flavour. So.
Yeah. What about yourself, Dave? Is there anything?
Yeah, you know, again, kind of going back to that, you know, how do you taste whiskey? The first thing I always look for when I'm putting it, you know, actually beginning to taste it, is actually not think about flavour. Actually, it's thinking about texture. You know, because I think the feel of a whiskey is really important, and you know, our sense of touch in the mouth is one thing that's often overlooked.
Yeah.
And this just comes in. It's a beautiful flow to it. There's a real succulence in the middle, which is always what I'm looking for. You know, a whiskey's kind of got to pause slightly in the middle of the tongue, because in the middle of the tongue, flavors change. You know, everything kind of meets in the middle, and then a new flavor begins to develop towards the finish. And you know, completely different maybe to the very front of the palate. So yes, you do get that kind of pepperiness coming through. But it's so soft, it just seems to slide down the tongue into the middle. And there are the fruits kind of sitting there in the middle. And you're so right, the smoke is there. And the smoke is almost acting as this binding agent. You know, it's coming in and it's making comments about, you know, where the pepper is and where the fruit is. And on the finish, you're getting just that little bit more coming through. So it's this real seamless. It's like a story. It's like a story of a piece of music. You have a beginning, a middle, and an end, but they've got to hold together. They've got to be coherent, and it's coherent.
I think that's a really good point, though, because for the first dram, I think a few people may be wondering this themselves, and especially as we go over the course of the night. You know, the recipe we have here is undoubtedly quite unusual. We're talking about, and this is what maybe I'd like you to expand on, Alistair. We're actually talking about two completely different forms of spirit, peated and unpeated spirit brought together. So, you know, the bottle says lightly peated, but it's a result of heavily peated and unpeated spirit brought together, and then cast into 3 different types of cask. So maybe for those who are a bit confused, or maybe looking at the single malt in the bottle and wondering where that kind of comes into it, could you give us a brief explanation of the recipe and how it's coming together? We'll obviously explore that.
Yeah, we'll go into it in detail, but yeah, so again, we knew when we set out, when we were designing the distillery, we designed it around the style of whiskey and the flavour of whiskey we want to make. We knew we wanted to produce a young whiskey and release a whiskey at a young age, but we also wanted it to be an excellent whiskey. And to do that, we needed to build in complexity and depth. So we've started with that kind of elegant theme, but complexity and depth. So the way we've done that is that for about 6 months of the year, we do unpeated. We use unpeated Scottish barley, and for the other 6 months we do peated. And what that means is that the peated barley comes in at 48 to 52 parts per million, which is fairly heavily peated. We take quite a narrow cut when we use that. But anyway, that gives you 2 separate styles, 2 different styles of whiskey made on Raasay that we then mature separately. And to continue adding these layers in, we have 3 different wood types that we mature the unpeated and the peated in completely separately. So that's where we get to the 6 casks. And that's why we've got these 6 samples in front of them. So if we then, after it's matured, so after 3 years, we brought all those casks together, we vatted them, we left them to marry, and then we slowly reduced them down to bottling strength. So by doing all of that and having all of these elements and building layers and using these in different quantities, I think that's allowed us to build the complexity and depth into the whiskey at such a young age.
Is this something that you've experienced much yourself, Dave? This kind of, when it comes to Scotch whiskey and whiskey in Scotland, is this quite outside the norm from what you've tended to see?
It's pretty unusual, to be perfectly honest. You know, there are distilleries, you know, well-established distilleries who make different styles, and they've always bottled them separately, which is absolutely fine. But it was a technique actually of making different styles of whiskey and blending them together. I first came across it in Japan, you know, where, you know, distilleries which weren't buying in stock for their blends from other Japanese distilleries, so they were having to make different styles in that single distillery and then blending them together. And I always thought, well, wouldn't it be great if that happened in Scotland? And boom, you know, it has, you know, because it does, and it allows 2 different facets of that magical thing called the distillery character, you know, the DNA, the fingerprint of the distillery, but done in 2 different ways. And by blending together at different ratios and from different casks, you're dead right. That's just going to add layers, add complexity to it. So yeah, it's a fairly radical step for Scottish whiskey to take. But I think it's is evidence of what's happening in the modern Scotch whisky industry. You know, is that, you know, people are thinking, oh, what is this thing called whisky, and moving it forward.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that, you know, for those who are unaware, we do tours and offer tours up here. We just started those, and it's something that comes up quite a lot. It's trying to explain to folks this process, how Scotch whisky is made, but then also what we're doing slightly differently as well. Now, everyone may have noted there's water being added to the whisky. Actually, probably a question that will come up, especially as we get onto our cask samples. When it comes to using water with single malts and stuff, what is your guys' approach? Especially in a tasting situation again like this.
Yeah, I mean, we bottled a reasonable strength to say 46.4, so you know, it's definitely designed to be able to add water too. And I think with our whiskey, with this bottling, the water actually had something and allows it to open up. So I think it'd be interesting to taste it with water, but I think it just brings a little bit more of the character out of the whiskey.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, if I'm tasting a whiskey, I'll always nose and taste neat, and I'll always add water, no matter what, because adding water, it opens the whiskey up. It shows qualities you might not have seen because of the alcohol that's got in the way. It can also show flaws, to be honest, not that there's any. I taste bad folks, you know, but you know, it's really important when you're tasting things to actually try and get as complete a picture as possible. And then at the end of it, you can kind of go, well, this is great with water, or actually I would prefer not to have it with water. But yeah, I would say as practice, always add water to it, especially when you're dealing with cask strength. Yeah, because whiskey's about pleasure, it's not about pain.
Yeah, I think especially when we go into these cask samples, it's actually remarkable how much they change with the addition of water. You know, and the way smoke will open up and transform, the way the spices and sweetness will move. You know,
and this, I mean, again, it's a textural thing. All those elements which you were noticing and were holding together beautifully are now just absolutely seamless. You know, it flows in a completely different way. It spreads across the tongue a lot more. So rather than kind of going straight down the tongue, it's kind of moving out across the tongue as well. So yeah, I would recommend a wee drop of water to open up.
Yeah, for me, it just balances it perfectly with that little drop of water.
Yeah. I think we've gotten a fair amount of good feedback towards the whiskey sour. It's always nice to hear. It's always good as well, I think, hearing folks opening up these bottles, pouring them out, tasting them, trying them. You know, it's obviously great for us. We've got a lot of time and effort, obviously, what goes into the whiskey. You know, there was a few comments here. Notice strawberry and blackcurrant jam on charcoal toast, oily buttery dough. Gentle peat, sprinkling of spicy pepper. I think that's a nice one. That's actually, I will say, that's by Callum and Kate Renton. They have joined, I think, 3 or 4 of our virtual tastings, and so have actually followed the development of these spirits closer than I think I have at this point. So I think that was some nice insights there as well. From Chris, great mouthfeel, like you were alluding to there as well, Dave. Dark fruits, apricot notes. Much more apparent when you go back to the nose after your first mouthful as well, which I think is really, I think it highlights that thing of, you know, it's not just that first impression. It is going back with water and seeing how it's changed, seeing how it's developed. Now we've got a lot of drams to get through, so we'll wrap up and kind of move on to our next one in a moment as well. Briefly, again, maybe Alistair, you could tell us, there is a reason we have gone through the kind of order that we're going through tonight. So like I mentioned, I mentioned at the start, and it should be in the chat, but of course we're going to rye, and then we're going to the virgin oak, and then we're going to the Bordeaux. There is a reason we picked that tonight, and it's to do somewhat with the recipe of the whiskey. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the order we're tasting them in is, so we're starting with the one that is our base, which is the rye, and then we build off the rye. And it's quite interesting. My great grandfather was a whiskey blender, and if you look at the recipes in the book, he very much had a base, but the top notes, what you actually taste, are the smaller amounts that float across the top. So we're going to do it in that order. So we're going to start with the rye, which is the base that we build off, and then we're going to do the Chinkapin oak cask, which is the middle amount, and then the Bordeaux red wine cask, which is the smallest amount. But having tasted the single malt, you'll see how those dark fruits from the red wine are just kind of floating across the top.
Definitely. Well, I think on that's a really good note actually to start pouring our drams. So those of you who have your drams ready, we're starting, like I say, with the unpeated rye. I remember we're dealing with cask strength samples, so I'll keep reminding you of that. About half a bottle of whiskey between all 6 of these things. But one of my favorites, I've always really loved the rye casks. Alistair, what is the thought process behind building our foundation of our recipe on rye?
Yeah, well, there's 2 reasons for choosing rye casks. One, primarily at the time when we were putting the recipe together, we kind of looked around the world at what other people were doing, and particularly in the States with the craft whiskey revolution there, they've managed to take rye whiskey from a kind of unloved, unfashionable drink to something that was really fantastic and really quite cool and trendy to drink, and something that was really enjoyable. So that was one element, and that kind of drew us to rye casks. But the other reason for using rye casks over bourbon casks is that rye gives this very characteristic black pepper note. And again, having tasted the single malt, you very much get that black pepper. Well, that's really the rye casks that are driving that. But also the rye casks are North American oak, they're Quercus alba. Quercus alba is used throughout the bourbon industry, and but what it does, once our spirit is maturing and gets past the rye and into that oak, into that Quercus alba, you actually start to get some of these butterscotch vanilla notes as well. So that would be more typical of bourbon. So yeah, very much about that kind of nod to the rye revolution in the States, but also bringing these characteristics that we want and building off that.
Yeah, I think when people look at these rye casks, I think immediately the most obvious thing is the color.
Yeah.
And I mean, as we look at it in the glass, we can see it's got this very lovely straw color to it. Nice, quite golden colors coming through.
Yeah.
In fact, yeah, you can actually see
with the sun shining.
Yeah, that's a really nice. That's a full cask sample bottle for sure there. Obviously compared to the other two, a little bit paler. But certainly that's not to put it down. It's just the result of the way the cask been.
It is. I mean, these are first fill rye casks, and that's a very typical colour for a 2-year-old single malt in a rye cask, and it's really the others when we move into it where the colour really kind of stands out.
And now, Dave, what are your first reactions? You've tried many of these cask samples before. We're now getting up to the point though where these cask samples are passing the point of becoming Scotch whisky. We're looking at sometimes 36 to 38 months in these. So what are your first reactions to the rye?
Well, it's the great thing about rye whiskey. I'm a huge fan of rye whiskey. Is that intensity that it has? It's a very immediate, it's a very direct style of whiskey. I often describe it as being like Clint Eastwood walking through the swinging saloon doors. It's there. It's not discreet. It's not shy in any way whatsoever. And that wonderful kind of pepperiness comes through. Pepper, kind of allspice, that tiny little bit, the kind of baking spices. Clove as well coming in. But I see exactly what you mean. The way in which you're beginning to get those kind of vanillins coming through, but it's not that big buttery style that you'll get from ex-bourbon casks, but it's still got that rye edge and that rye in the nicest possible way bite. I find it quite hot, so I will be adding water relatively quickly. I'm going to take a wee taste just to. You've got the sweetness, you've got the pepper, you've also got this lovely kind of green apple thing coming through, which I think is more rye than because your new make isn't really
we don't really
green
get
apple
that,
at all. But green apple is an absolute classic signature for me for rye. So that's adding. It's not just putting stuff in a cask. It's actually saying, right, what is the cask going to contribute? How are the flavors from the cask and that previous fill going to benefit and work with our distillery character or distillery characters? So yeah, I think it's great. And I can see why you've got this as the base, because it's a fantastic platform for everything else to work on.
I was going to say there's quite a few good comments, and apologies, I'm looking through the chat and keeping an eye on it. I do love all the comment and questions. We will try and get through them as well. I noticed Steve there saying rye, a fantastic base to the whiskey, and a lot of great reactions. There was a good one there, Mark, saying getting sort of sweet shop flavors. I just can't place the exact flavor, but it's really lovely. And that's often something I struggle with. I'm nowhere near up to the skill level of you guys. So often it's those really interesting reminiscing notes that come through that you just can't exactly place. And sometimes you'll be walking down the street, you walk into a sweet shop, and all of a sudden that's it. It clicks in your head, you know.
I mean, your sense of smell is linked, inextricably linked to your memory. The first time you smell something, you will never forget it. So it's always that when you smell something, it's that the intensity of that first encounter that comes through. And that's why so many of them are childhood memories. And they're cultural as well. I mean, we're Scottish, therefore we're brought up in sweeties and chips, and But whereas I mean, you've got people all around the world, and they're coming from different cultures, different food cultures. So the fact that we're talking about this doesn't mean that's the only thing that's in there. You will be finding your own way of describing this whiskey, and just because we appear to be saying something different doesn't mean that you're wrong, and it certainly doesn't mean we're wrong. And that's the joy about whiskey. I think when you're tasting, especially when you're tasting in a group, is that you're playing this kind of tennis, almost.
Exactly.
What are you getting? What are you getting? Oh, I see that. So, but certainly with a wee drop of water, can you get back to the whiskey? I think you're doing it. Get it down.
Just kind of brings that black pepper down. I mean, neat without the water, the black pepper's right up there up front, and then the water, you're into the balance, you're into those sweeter notes.
It's actually shifted that pepper further back in the palate. It's quite interesting, rather than being, boom, here's a grinding of black pepper right in the tip of the tongue. It's further back. So really. Yeah, it's good.
I think the sweetness of our new make as well comes out with water as well, and that, as you say, in that middle palate.
Because that's a good point. Of course, a lot of people maybe don't fully recognise or appreciate the real impact that the distillery production has and the production of the new make itself. Obviously, it's something we're going to explore as we get onto a different form of spirit, in the form of the peated spirit. But is it fair to say, that the distilling process that we have here plays a huge effect in the base of the actual spirit itself?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, we had complete luxury of starting with a blank sheet of paper and being able to design a distillery that would produce the style of whiskey that we wanted to. So in crude terms, it was lightly peated and dark fruit. But then you have to work out, how do you get to that? How do you actually get the spirit to taste like that? And a big part of that is our fermentation.
Right,
So we do, 3 to 5 day fermentation. So the 5-day fermentation really gets you into that kind of black fruit, that kind of element that we want in the whiskey. So absolutely, from that very point, and making sure that the yeast develops the flavors that we want, that we can then distill over. And we've got cooling jackets on the washbacks as well. So we've got a little bit of control over the temperature. So for example, if we set it at 32, it stops the temperature at 32. If we allow it to go over 32, you get more fusel oils, heavier compounds building up in the actual wash itself. And by controlling that, again, it allows us to steer the spirit to these two different styles that we're actually producing on Raasay. And we do, so it's 3 and 5 days. So when we're on 2 shifts, you have 6 long fermentations. And 4 short fermentations a week. So again, you've got these other characteristics, and we can go to those casks and pick them out. But with this, obviously, we batted them all together. So again, it's another way of getting these layers of complexity into the spirit.
I think through the power of Zoom, I can put on a virtual background. I can actually show you guys the interior of it looks like. What I will say is like a strange weatherman projection map. All of a sudden, we might suddenly appear through it. But I will show you quickly. You can see Dave and Alistair floating like ghosts in the middle of the distillery right now. But of course, you actually have our 6 washbacks lined up there, and then the actual distills themselves in the very far back. Alistair, that's maybe a question that a lot of people are maybe asking is why Raasay? It's obviously a very unusual recipe. It's quite an unusual site for a distillery, I suppose. For those who are unaware, Raasay, about 14 miles long, about 3.5 miles wide. There's about 23 square miles in total, 160 folks that live here. We actually print that on the bottle if you want to know more of these details. The way I always describe it is we're the exact same size and shape as Manhattan, but with 1.6 million over there and 162 here. So what's the kind of background behind finding Raasay and choosing it as the site for the distillery?
So when Bill and I started having these discussions about the distillery, we talked about where in Scotland we would do it. And it was actually Bill through Ian Hector Ross that put forward Raasay as the place to go. And I came up with Bill 7 years ago in May 2014, and we stood outside. You saw the derelict building. It was a derelict hotel at the time. We stood outside me, kind of like, can we turn this into the distillery? And now, you know, you can't unfortunately see it on Zoom, but the view, particularly this evening, looking out there, the views to Skye are absolutely amazing. So that just captures you straight away. But really, the whole thing started around the water. You know, so we've got our own well on site, and Raasay's got a really complex geology. So there's a lot of volcanic rock. But where we are at the distillery, we're on top of this really old Jurassic sandstone, which is fractured and acts like a big sponge. So when it rains, and it does occasionally rain on it.
Wouldn't believe it actually today, I know. I wish.
The rain falls, obviously the highest point is Duncan, and that's a basalt outcrop, and then surrounding the distillery is lots of granite, so the water, you know, and that's all impervious, so the water runs across all that volcanic rock, picks up all these minerals, and it ends up where we are. So, you know, we've got that kind of unique water. It's also slightly hard water. Now, typically, there are a few other distilleries in Scotland would have it, but typically it would be soft water. Yeah. So, but the most important element in that for us is that we've got manganese in our water, and the manganese really helps the yeast develop. So again, that goes back to our fermentations and being able to develop the flavors and being able to develop the yeast. So that incorporated, and also, you know, being a small island, you know, since we started, the community is hugely supportive in what we're doing, and you know, we'll talk more about that. And really, it's, you know, we're celebrating tonight our launch of our single malt. It's taken, as I say, 7 years ago since I first came up with the book. It's taken us at least 3 years with all the team here and everybody sat outside tonight, putting the effort in to create this whiskey. So it is very much about the island, and we mature everything on the island, we bottle everything on the island. The water that I mentioned, we don't only use that in the process, we use it for cooling, but we use it for cask reduction. So although we distill a lot of the water out in the process, we add it back in at cask reduction. And because we bottle on site, we use the same water again on site. So, you know, it's all matured on the island. So, you know, we can talk about what influence the maturation and what influence the climate of Raasay has on the development of the whiskey. But the fact is, the whiskey is a result of where it's made. So, you know, Isle of Raasay, Hebridean, single malt, it is very much about here and where we make it.
Yeah, I'm sure yourself, Dave, as an outsider looking into the island. I mean, obviously, I was born and raised here, and the difference between 5 years ago and now, I always say, is amazing. And the next 5 years, I always think, are going to be the most exciting. Watching and seeing where this goes and what it means for the island. But that sort of idea of the whiskey isn't just what we make; it's formed by the distillery and the community and the history and the culture is something I know you've talked a lot about. So I'm sure it's something that kind of echoes with you.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think it's great that people are now talking about this. That for too long, whiskey has been seen just as this product or as a brand and made in these kind of anonymous places called distilleries. And it's kind of sat in a silo, you know, okay, we're like, I know it's coming from a distillery, but you know, it's kind of over there. and that distillery just happens to be in that place. Whereas in fact, you know, a distillery is the heart of a community. The distilleries are there for a very good reason. You know, because they will all produce something which is unique to that place. And we were having a chat about this last night, which is, and it's fascinating to talk to distillers in general. But you know, you set out to read, okay, right? So it's going to be light peated, it's going to have dark fruit on it, and you set a distillery up to work within those kind of parameters. But the distillery kind of decides what style within those parameters it's going to make. So the distillery is a living, breathing thing, you know, so the distillery is bringing its own personality into it. And I think culturally, it's also incredibly important. And, you know, coming back to that point I was making earlier, you know, culturally, it's vitally important here. It's important to the Hebrides. It's important to the west coast of Scotland. You know, that there are distilleries here that speak of place and speak of people, and they're not just anonymous factories. You know, that they're living, breathing entities and literally distillations of where they're from.
Yeah, I think it's quite remarkable seeing, like I say, that distinction between it. But it's also quite funny I've been here since kind of day one, and it's amazing to see how the whiskey has obviously had this plan and this recipe, but it's been amazing actually seeing how we've kind of formed this identity over the last 3 or 4 years. That's just a result of all the stuff that's happened, and the way we have to react to situations, and maturation island, even the things down to the gin that we're producing, all this kind of stuff.
It's organic. It's an organic process. I mean, I think if you just walked in with a formula and kind of went, well, this is what we're going to make, and I'll press a button and it's going to come out the other end. I mean, that's not what whiskey making is about. Whiskey making is about getting your hands dirty and actually being actively involved in the creation of those flavors and finding new ways and continuing to develop and continuing to innovate.
Mm-hmm. Now, apologies, the camera turned off there. I think what happened is my camera's overheated over there, so we switched over to Alistair and Dave Cam. I'm still here, by the way.
I was wondering why I was looking totally not only the second dram.
You're getting an idea now of just how bright it is. Well, I'll tell you what, though, this is a really good time, I think, to move on to our next dram. Okay. So our next dram is going to be the Virgin Chinkapin Oak. Yes. As Alistair mentioned, this is, I suppose, more of a kind of body. It's the second largest component of the single malt. Now, while you guys are pouring that and smelling it, tasting it, I may go and see whether I can get our camera turned again. But it would be quite interesting. Again, we've gone through this now. I think we know our process somewhat. We're letting the spirit sit. We're having a nosing of it. We're then having a taste. But immediately, what I suppose the most striking thing about these virgin oak casks is the colour. Yeah. And I guess maybe, Alistair, it would be maybe quite good to provide a little bit of background about what exactly a virgin Chinkapin Oak cask is, and then Dave, maybe your reactions to it.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, you can see from the colour difference from the worst whiskey. I mean, it's in such a short period of time to have that much colour, and that really comes from the cask itself. So, virgin Chinkapin Oak casks actually, Quercus Muhlenbergi, so. Why Quercus Muhlenbergi? Well, we spoke briefly about Quercus alba earlier and the fact that it typically brings these kind of vanilla notes and sweet spice to it. Well, Quercus Muhlenbergi for me is a much softer oak. The acorns are edible, it's sweeter, and again, it brings more of that dark fruit characteristic that we're looking for. Because they haven't had anything in them before, and they're high char and high toast. The char obviously helps with the colour. The toast caramelizes the natural sugars in the wood, so that's building up that kind of sweet caramel flavour as well. So it's very much about bringing another layer to the whiskey itself.
Yeah, for me, it adds the mellowness. It's the one you've got that kind of that great rye base with all these elements within it, and this just kind of goes, hey. Yeah, chill, guys. And it just adds that beautiful softness to it. Mm-hmm. It's an oak that I really wasn't aware of. I knew it by name, from like Californian writers. You get walking through forests of Chinkapin, and it's like, what is this? And I think it's a classic example of how the whiskey industry is now beginning to look deeper into this subject of oak, which I know you're definitely doing, because everything was just called Quercus alba. It was American white oak. But if you actually then step back and actually have a look at how many different species of American white oaks there are, and all of them with different flavour characteristics, and Chinkapin is just extraordinary, for it's got this real sweetness to it. It doesn't have that big vanilla thing. It's more kind of maple syrup for me.
Very much.
It's that. I remember the first time I had it, like a year or so ago. Mm-hmm. It's like the American diner at breakfast. It's got that wonderful kind of cinnamon buns and warm leatherette. To quote a Grace Jones song. But and that maple syrup dribbled over pancakes. It's just grand. This wonderful fruitiness coming through. So totally different to what you would normally associate with Quercus alba.
Yes. Yeah. And I think with our new make spirit, said earlier, our new make spirit is actually very, very sweet. There's a sweetness to it, and it has these black fruits to it, and it really interacts with the Quercus Muhlenbergi, the Chinkapin oak. And I think it just, as I say, for us, it's that next layer. It's that next layer on top of the rye.
There's almost this like kind of minty thing going on in the background there, just before I'm going to add the water. And it's an interesting one for me, you know, that it's not as hot as the rye, because the oak's been more active.
Yeah.
You know, so the oak is kind of covering up the alcohol to some degree. So it's easier to take neat, although I would always add a drop of water.
That is something that's maybe come up, but I did notice there was a couple of questions about it in terms of the interior of these casks. I mean, that's something a lot of people don't get a chance to really see or experience. It is something we also mentioned that these are heavy toast, heavy char. Maybe also you could expand a bit on specifically what kind of specification we have for these casks.
Yeah, so the first thing we specify is the timber is air dried for at least 36 months, at least 3 years. Air drying, and what that does is it seasons the oak before it's even made into staves, and if you like, that starts to tenderize. The wood starts to open up through that process. So that's the first thing we specify. So all of our Chinkapin oak casks have been, the timber's been air dried for 36 months, which is reasonable length of time. In fact, the very first cask we used had actually been air dried. The timber had actually been air dried for 7 years. Wow. Well on its way to opening up. So that's one, the charring. So some people call it crocodile skin. So it's, you know, it's a naked flame charring the wood. And what that does is it literally opens up the cask. But that charcoal also helps to purify the spirit as well. It takes some of the impurities out. And as I said before, on the toast, we use a high toast. That's radiated heat. So instead of a naked flame, it's literally like putting it in front of a 3-bar electric fire and radiating that heat in, and it caramelizes the sugar. So that's what we're specifying. So it's not just the oak species itself, but it's all of these other elements that we bring in just to get the flavors that we're looking for.
No, it's absolutely fascinating. It's a real revelation. You know, the first time I tried this, it was great. You know, this is, you know, it's a kind of a new frontier for oak, and you know, it works particularly well. And this is the other important thing I think is that, talking to whiskey makers such as yourself, is that you're thinking, right, I've got this new made character. What cask is going to work with it? Some casks might not work with it. Other casks will. So how can I find the perfect partner, and what is it going to do down the line? That's why I could never be a whiskey maker. Actually, you know, anticipating what is going to happen in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years time in a cask is a rare skill to have, and this is just a perfect accompaniment to your distillery character.
I think this is by far always really exciting hearing folks' reactions to this, because, and I think, you know, I agree. I think that most people find these to be some of the most favorite because there's so much flavor, so much to talk about with them. I've just got a few comments from folks. Mike Jackson. It's cinnamon. That's the note I was getting. Wasn't expecting that. Mark's is Toblerone, which is good. Chris has got a lovely one, which I really like. Beautiful sweet flavors, toffee Dundee cake, touch of spice and slight pepper. Really, really good note, and a lot of people saying that it benefits from that water. I think we can agree with all of these, but I really find it opens up, and I personally have found over these tastings that when we get to the peated variety, the Chinkapin really changes and really adds a lot of dimension when you add in that water. Really adds a lot to it. So yeah, really, really good feedback. Apologies, like I say, for some of the tech issues. I genuinely think the heat in this room is starting to break some of the stuff around here, which is never it was never a problem we had to prepare for on Raasay before. But yeah, now I think it's something you had mentioned a little bit with the water and the production. It's something maybe I did notice a couple of questions about it. What does a longer fermentation time actually do to the spirit when it's, you know, and the effect it has before it goes into the cask?
So, I mean, effectively, when you're fermenting 48 hours, the yeast has done its job. So if all you want is alcohol, that first 48 hours is alcohol. And everything after that's where the flavour development starts. So by the time you get to 70 hours, the yeast has started to die off. And that in itself actually starts to bring character, because the yeast cells die and they open up, and it's called lysis, and some of that content that comes out, and you get more of this kind of like oily butteriness. But the other thing for me that's really fascinating is that from 70 hours on, you get lactobacillus development. And lactobacillus just fascinates me. And part of that is because I at one point worked in the dairy industry, and lactobacillus is incredibly important for that. But the fact that we then get this lactobacillus development, now the lactobacillus comes in on the barley itself. So if you like, the hive, the reservoir of our lactobacillus is actually our grist bin. Right. And then so we're always bringing that through. And I think, well, you can talk about this, David. There's been a study done, and there was something like 32 different strains, and each distillery has got its own different, if you like, community of lactobacillus. So what that does is it starts to produce lactic acid. The lactic acid obviously reduces the pH, but the lactic acid itself interacts with the esters. So you start to get these much more complex flavor congeners. So you're creating all of that in the wash bag, which then when you distill it over, but you've got to create it first. So for me, the long fermentations is about these elements, and the fact that we've got 3 days, we've got that 70 hours, so we're into that sort of the yeast dying off anyway in the short fermentation. But then with the long fermentations, you get all these other chemicals building up and the flavor compounds. So you've got to develop the flavor in the fermentation, otherwise you can't still.
It's so important. It tends to be you do tours around distilleries and everybody kind of goes, oh yeah, not like fermentation, that's fine. Oh, stills, everybody's saying, oh, the stills. And the stills are really important. Don't get me wrong, stills are really important, but the flavor is made in fermentation. Your distillation is about selection, and it's about concentration.
Absolutely.
So the flavors have to be there. So if you can start playing tunes on that with longer fermentations and create those fruity characters and more complex characters, they're going to be coming across in distillation. You can then make that selection. But that scientific paper, it's super geeky now. But that scientific paper about every individual distillery having its own specific colony of lactobacillus still hasn't been proved if they all necessarily contribute flavor-wise. But it has been proven time and time again that distilleries built next to each other will make different characters, even if they're set up in exactly the same way. So there is something. I prefer to think of it as magic, but but it could, there might be another little clue. But it's about place. You will only get this colony here on Raasay.
The island kind of forming the flavour of
this. Exactly.
Now, I think probably a good point as well for us to look at moving on to our next dram as well. What we're going to do is move on to the final of our unpeated. So our unpeated selection is the Ex-Bordeaux. That's what's left. We'll then move on to the peated. Before we move on to the peated, I'd like to, put up a poll. Love to hear what folks' favourites are as they came through. We've also got a short video as well that I'd like to play at our kind of midway point too. But I think to me, this has always been the most surprising for me. When I first started tasting these Bordeaux casks, way back at the start of our virtual tastings, which is well over a year ago, almost a year and a half ago now, they were, I would say, the weakest out of the pack. And I mean, that's not a bad thing. You're talking, taking cask samples. They're going to be sometimes not as full, not as rich, not as well developed. Myself and my colleague Scott, who's in the chat as well, we've always agreed that over the last few months, these have just come on in leaps and bounds. And I'm always really excited to hear. I'd be really interested what you guys think. Really interested to hear what the chat thinks as well. But as a quick background, Alistair, what exactly are we talking about when we say ex-Bordeaux red wine casks?
So they're all casks that have previously had Bordeaux wine in them. We get them from the chateau, and we can't use the chateau names in our marketing, but we have used chateaus along the lines of Calais Segura, Chateau Margaux, Chateau Parma. So they're all really high quality wine casks. And again, talking about oak species, you're looking at Quercus petrea and Quercus roba. You'll notice when you look at the cask that even from the same chateau, you'll have a number of different Tonnelles or couperages, and they all use different amounts of the petrea and roba to balance their recipe. So we're effectively, if you like, inheriting the wood policy from the chateau. And going back to Callum's point there about in the initial stages, so at that early point when we put our spirit into the cask, it's very much the red wine that dominates. So you get that kind of black grape flavour. But I kept saying it, and when we were doing the tastings and we're in the warehouses, but just wait, it's going to go past the wine, and it's going to get into the French oak. And I think, from what you and Scott are picking out, is that point where it changes from the red wine influence to you start getting the influence of the French oak. And that brings the balance, and that brings the depth. And that's why we're using these casks. And we said before, we use these in the smallest proportion. So this is the top note. This is what's floating across the top of that single malt.
Yeah, this is when we've done a number of interviews with Dave. We've sat down, we've corralled him into the warehouse and got him to talk about these. And one of the best descriptions I remember all the time is you talk about this Bordeaux almost being like a seasoning, you know. And what are your reactions now? Again, when you were tasting it almost a year ago, probably, I don't know if you agree, very different kind of beast, and now developing. So yeah, I'd like to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, they were, you know, as you correctly pointed out, quite shy at that point. And I mean, that's not uncommon if you're using Quercus Petrea. You know, it's a tighter grain. It takes longer for everything to start penetrating into it. And wine hasn't really done it, for wine's lower in alcohol. But, you know, if you look at the colour, you know, if you think of all the kind of wine finishes and wine casks which are out there, you know, they tend to be kind of bright red. And you look at the colour of this, the colour of which in wine terms would be called onion skin. Yeah. You know, and it's gone past that red. You're now beginning to get that, the oak elements coming out. So it's new make spirit plus the wine element plus the oak. And actually it's plus the way in which the wine and the oak have interacted with each other. So you're actually, by maturing rather than just finishing, you're actually getting a far more complex character coming through. And I know I agree 100% that this is really coming on in leaps and bounds now. There's a subtlety to it. It's still the seasoning, but there's a real finesse and a real subtlety coming through here.
It's actually quite interesting to note about the colour in there as well, because I do often see it in this. When people look at our single malt, they'll see, I think, on the surface what looks to be quite a heavy rye influence. I think we can agree there is a lot of rye influence in this. And the Bordeaux is the smallest of the influences and the ingredients. But like you say, sometimes that can actually come through even stronger as a result. And I notice that I do a lot of the photography here. And one thing I'll notice is if you boost the saturation on a picture of one of these, you'll see that red blush start to come out, and it's distinct from the virgin oak. And it's just that presence of the slight redness that's coming out from the Bordeaux casks. And it's interesting to me. Visually, it sort of indicates that idea of just that little bit of that little influence of the Bordeaux, but it shines through. It's just hidden away there sometimes.
And there's a beautiful juiciness to it. There's again, just thinking of, you know, other ways of describing on the palate. You know, there's a mouth-watering quality to it. Yeah, you know, that you're salivating when you're drinking it. And I think I love this. You know, I'm not the world's biggest fan of wine cask finished whiskies. You know, I think they tend to be fairly crude and they get too vinous. You know, they're just a bit clumsy. Whereas you've got a little bit of structure coming through on this. You've got that juicy character coming in. That's great. Really good.
And there's a lot of lovely feedback towards this. Notice quite a few folks talking about the sort of jammy notes, slightly balsamic on the nose as well, and vinegary. Little notes of and sweet fruits, blueberries, blackcurrants, redcurrants, rhubarb. Absolutely. I think a lot of comments that call back to the idea of the dark fruit.
Yeah, and I like the rhubarb one. Particularly. I'm a big rhubarb fan.
I think what interests me about sometimes the Bordeaux is that although you would immediately think of it as maybe when you think of a wine cap, it's going to be sweet and it's going to be jammy, it's going to be fruity. There's actually quite a lot of that. I suppose it's quite overused, but maritime notes and saltier notes and more savoury notes that come through. That's one of the things that always surprises me. And that's why I think that, again, not trying to influence any polls here, but the Unpeated Bordeaux, I think, is amazing, and how much it's changed my opinion over these last few months. It's really gone up to the top. It's one of my favourites.
I see what you mean. That kind of slight minerality coming through in the finish, and there's a brightness and there's an acidity in there as well. There's another element you know people again don't really talk about. You talk about it all the time in wine, about acidity. They tend not to talk about it in whiskey, but it is there, and it's really important in terms of balance. Especially if you've got sweetness kind of sitting there in the middle. You need that, not just spikes, but you need that kind of slight bright character coming through in the finish. So
I think probably a good point now. We've tasted all of these. We've now gone through the first three. And of course, what's really interesting is we've now tasted three identical spirits, but with changes brought out by the casks. What we're going to be doing next, of course, is tasting the same cask types, but of course, they're a completely different spirit. We've already briefly touched on water, but I feel like that's sometimes a good point to bring up when we're talking about the wine cask. I feel like the provenance of it and the influence of the water, I think sometimes can even shine through with these casks. So, you know, it's an important point that we do all of that on site. But what does it mean to both of you guys that our entire production, both the distillation, the casking, the spirit reduction, the bottling, is all happening with that one water source?
For me, it's huge because again, it identifies it as being influenced by Raasay. It's literally the water underneath the site that we're using. So it's very much identifies it as Raasay. And the other thing, being perfectly honest about it, it's something that other distilleries don't do. So again, the influence of Raasay, but something that actually gives us a bit of uniqueness about our whiskey, and uniquely Raasay.
Yeah. And and it's genuine. People see through marketing bullshit. They do. And it's genuine.
Yeah.
And I think and it becomes another fascinating story to tell.
I think that's one of the things that I enjoy most about doing tours, and we do a lot of the marketing, photography around here, is that we can be quite honest and transparent about everything. If you want to see the bottling, if you want to see the maturation, it's all kind of up here in front of us, and there's nothing we shy away from. If it's 100% Scottish barley, if it's even things like, and we'll probably end up touching on it later on, but the barley trials, we're trying to grow barley on the island and various things. I think, like you say, people are savvy, they can look things up, people want to research and understand their whiskey more, and it makes it a lot more enjoyable from my point of view to talk about, when you know that every aspect is an enjoyable and something that we've taken the care and the attention.
I mean, rather than feeling you have to make up a story to sell something, you've got something absolutely genuine.
Yeah.
And the whole issue of provenance is incredibly important to today's consumer. And single malt has got that. It's got that in spades. But to be able to add to that provenance and actually go, well, you know what? Everything's done here. That's a big tick in terms of consumer acceptance. So if I can lapse into marketing,
great. But no, well, the thing is, we've now gotten to the end of our first drams. Again, lovely reactions. Apologies. I do try and go through all of these, try and read through all these comments. I do have notes here, and I often take tasting notes. So as they come in, I'm reading them live and noting them down. And there was one that I noticed there. I think perhaps it was John. I missed the comment coming in saying that he'd already tried the Bordeaux earlier at another previous virtual tasting, and he was really impressed by the way it improved, which is something I had mentioned, which I'm glad someone else agrees with me too. But I think what we'll do now is I'll put up the first poll of the night. I'd like to hear what everyone's thoughts are and favorites are. As I'm doing that, I'd like to maybe hear from you. I don't want to sway anyone too much, but out of these three, is there one that you feel you've enjoyed the most tonight, or surprised you, or was most interesting to talk about?
That's incredibly hard. It's very, very difficult. I mean, on the night, I'm probably with Callum and just enjoying the fact that this Bordeaux has really, and Dave, as you said, you've been here 4 years and you've seen it change, and this is the one that really has developed. And I'm a huge fan of the wood policy and the cask that we're using, but I think particularly having been saying to people it will change. Yes, it's very nice to see that it has.
I mean, I wouldn't disagree with that. I think it's showing elegance and subtlety, and for me that's the one that's really fascinated me the most. I think those first three, which are all excellent. Yeah, and just kind of one final thing about it. The other thing, it's that attention to detail, because once again, within the whiskey industry, you see an awful lot of red wine casks. But that means nothing. What was the chateau? You might not be able to name it on the label, but do you know where it came from? Do you know what the grape variety was? Do you know who the cooper was? What type of oak was it? How many times was it filled with wine? How heavily was it toasted? All these questions which a winemaker would ask about the cask tend not to be asked by the whiskey industry.
Yeah,
whereas here, we know it's here.
You want to know it, we can tell you.
It's tick, 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 and that attention to detail means that you're really looking deep into what those flavors are at the moment, and how they are then produced, rather than just using this thing called a wine cask to give a fairly superficial character to your whiskey. So deep thinking produces great whiskey.
We do have, the results are coming in live. It's quite amazing. So I think what I'll do is I'll end the poll. I see there that 80% of people have voted, so you've got about 2 seconds left to get your votes in. But I will say it looks like the virgin Chinkapin is pulling ahead. then all of the lobbying we've done for the Bordeaux has brought that in a second. Finished by the rye, which, to be fair, the rye I think is the rye's always been my favorite, always a favorite cask of mine. But I'll end the poll there, and we can share the results. And yeah, share the results there. Virgin Chinkapin Oak, I think, is one of the most unusual casks to a lot of people. I think a lot of people aren't used to experiencing it in that way. I think when folks see, for example, again, showing it, but the color of that, and knowing that this sample is actually possibly even a few months older than this one, seeing the difference, it surprised people, and those flavors that come through as a result too. But someone actually asked the question about these as well, about how we can reuse and utilize the cask after the fact. Are we always going to be using these types of casks and always using them for the first time? Or are we going to be refilling them and utilizing them in different ways?
So this is very much our recipe. This is what our single malt is all about. It is about the unpeated, the peated, and these 3 casks. But the recipe lends itself to the whiskey maturing and aging. So, you know, obviously Virgin Chinkapin Oak cask, we can fill that again. It's a first fill cask. You know, the rye and the Bordeaux are all first fill casks. So we fill them again, it's a second fill. They're still active casks. So, you know, we can actually lay down older whiskey. So we can get to our 10, 12 plus using the same cask. Now, yes, we'll always bring in a percentage of the casks that are new casks. But as the time goes on and as we empty and refill more casks, then I think the recipe is dynamic. It allows us to grow. It allows us to age, and that was genuinely part of the thought process in choosing these casks.
Yeah, not like it would be pretty boring. Just say, oh, that's it. You know, I'm retired and put my feet up. You know, and also, I mean, that Chinkapin is a very active cask. You know, so you know, if you're planning 10, 12 years ahead, you know, that's going to be pretty mental.
Still going to be going.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is, I think a lot of folks chatting about this as well, about their favourites and stuff too. It's quite interesting. Someone, which I think is quite a nice comment, and something we're quite happy with is, thank you for providing 5 CL samples, little bottles that we provided. Always find they better capture flavours, and I'll be able to re-explore them tomorrow. Yeah. I think that's a really good point. Yeah. I think it's going to be really interesting for those of you at home that haven't tried these or are saving some to go back and revisit them and see what sorts of flavours come out later down the line. But yeah, now what we're going to do now, that's us finished our unpeated section. I actually have a short video that we've recorded that I'll play for you guys. We'll drink a few gallons of water. Thankfully, the sun has faded somewhat. We're a bit better. But yeah, we'll play a short video for you guys, and then what we'll do is we'll get started with our unpeated. Now remember the heavily peated. Now remember the peated samples are the same. We'll be starting with the rye. We'll then be moving on to the virgin oak, and then we'll be finishing with the Bordeaux. And when we get to the end of our samples, we'll also throw open for some more Q&A questions. So if you've got any more questions like that, please feel free to add them into the Q&A section. We're taking notes of those. I've been adding those into the evening tonight as well. But this little recording that we've got is a little interview that I recorded with Norman, who's the manager of the distillery. Now, Norman actually built the distillery as well as then became the manager. It's your classic island progression where you just take on every job you can, you know. And also with the operators, who have, many of whom, like Joseph and Ross, Naomi, have been here since almost the day one, making, distilling, producing the spirit that we're obviously tasting tonight. So I sat down with them and I got just a reaction to the single malt, some of whom had tried it only for the first time that night, and also just chatted a little bit about, you know, what it's like working in a distillery as well too. So we'll just put that on now. I'll just share that with you guys. Video.
So yeah, making whiskey parts. That initial bit's the easy bit.
Yeah. What we do with it after.
That's what we do after.
That's it, yeah.
Between then and drinking it.
Yeah. I think it's definitely more hands-on than it looks for a start as well. when people walk in, you see the big massive screen with buttons apparently everywhere, but we don't actually need to use a lot of them. So there's a lot of valve opening, but then
most stuff we do is outside of the distillery.
I suppose it's more how much of, not necessarily what happens on the production floor, it's what happens below, and the warehousing, the bottling, the batting, the cask filling, how much of that is part of your day.
This is my first.
Yeah.
Yeah, with this you get like a sweetness, but like that sort of spiciness. But I find also it's quite smooth when it's in the mouth, like a sweet apricot sort of, or like a more lighter fruit sweetness coming through.
There's definitely a lot more saltiness about
and that one,
about the inaugural, yeah.
Yeah, remember we were trying the casks. There's quite a marked difference between how you like a real salty maritime note in certain casks against others.
Yeah, the red wine ones are sort of can be quite surprising. Just like two casks beside each other could be the same filling day.
Until you get nosebleed.
It smells the same.
Yeah. Everything smells the same.
Yeah.
I mean, like even 3 years before, this got renovated, it was a, rundown shell of a hotel. I wouldn't have thought, oh, there's a distillery for you.
Like I struggle to imagine what other industry could do this in Raasay.
Yeah.
Well, like, can you imagine anything else that's going to support this many people and have be so long term? I suppose. So you see projects popping up. There's been a lot of projects in Raasay in the last 10 years. And then they fall down the wayside. That's what, or even stuff like the pier happened. There was a huge amount of work that happened for 2 years. But that's it done. Once it's done, it's done. Nothing carries on. But this goes on and on. It's kind of fortuitously ended up coming back here to 2016 to start building the place. Yeah, it's just it was never a plan to work in the distillery. It was always a plan to come back here and work building it and then move on to something else. But it's just the opportunities that was given to myself and like everyone else here. Like you can see how many people there are of my age or a bit younger or a bit older being on Raasay and from Raasay to be able to stay here, and even importing people like Tom. That's a real
delight.
It's a real delight. Makes me very happy.
I'm a rare import actually.
Yeah. Exporting whiskey and importing Tom.
So yeah, that was a sit down at the interview. I think I could hear them clapping over there. So, I mean, they're the operator, they're clapping themselves, which is fair. It's good, it's always good. But no, it's really good because I think it's always good to hear from folks like the operators who are in here every day, 6 in the morning till 10 p.m. or later or earlier, working 5 days a week, sometimes longer than that, getting this ready. And of course, it's important to point out that we do everything. We've mentioned it before, but everything from distillation to the casking, maturation, bottling here on site. And we've already touched on it, but that was always an important point to the business, I'm sure, as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And you said it yourself, Callum, you were away in Orkney and came back, and Norman's been away off Raasay as well. So it's absolutely fantastic to bring people back to the island, and there's distilleries that allowed us to do that.
Yeah, definitely. Now, we're moving on to our next set of drams. We're now on the peated, which is always exciting. I know that a lot of people look forward to the peated stuff. It's something important to know. You might have heard me mention it a few times that we're talking about heavily peated. Alistair, maybe you could expand on this slightly, but in the kind of industry terms, the barley that we're receiving to produce this spirit is some of the I suppose, quite heavily peated for an industry standard.
It is. I mean, it's, you know, as I said before, it's 100% Scottish barley, but it's peated to 48 to 52 parts per million. So it's pretty heavily peated. But again, we mentioned sort of elegance before. So we take quite a narrow cut on that. And then, of course, when it comes to vatting it, we're vatting it with the unpeated. So by the time we get to the bottle, and this particular bottling is probably in the region of about 6 to 7 parts per million. So the difference being what is in the bottle compared to what's the barley. But again, by bringing in heavily peated barley, it gives us that other layer, and it allows us to play with it. So we can play with the cut points, we can widen them, we can go slightly more peated. And of course, you know, we always talk about having the cooling jacket on the line arm of the wash still, which we can have off or on, and we tend to have it on when we're on peated barley and creating peated spirit, and that actually forms a loop, and it builds up all of these more heavier phenolic compounds. So yes, heavily peated barley, narrow cut, so that narrows it down again. But then you put the cooling jacket on in the line arm, that builds it back up again. You put it in a cask, it starts degrading again. And then you mix it with unpeated and it changes. So it's a constant changing through the process. And we look very closely at that. And, you know, it's probably worth saying that, you know, we are going to do another release of our signature single malt later in the year. And it will have a slightly higher peat level in the bottle. So it's something that just allows us to...
Because you can.
Indeed.
That's maybe a good point for yourself, though, Dave. You know, I don't know what you think yourself. I think sometimes there's maybe a misunderstanding about smoke and peat, that it's a sort of binary. It's peated whiskey, it's a non-peated whiskey. What are you maybe looking for in this, or from what you've tasted so far in peated samples in the past, do you notice quite a variance in the smoke and the way that it's developing in different casks or anything?
You notice I'm very wary about using ppm figures because, you know, a distiller needs to know that we'll set the maltster a target of phenolic parts per million. But these phenols are lost all the way through process. You lose some in the mashing, you certainly lose a lot in distillation, but a lot end up in faints. And a lot of the phenols, you know, as well, you know, some of the phenols aren't even discernible on the nose. That they can be measured, but are not necessarily there. So just saying it's heavily peated and phenolic parts per million doesn't actually mean that much, because it's how it comes across the new make stage. That's important. The other thing to think about in terms of peat is where the peat's coming from. Because peat has, and I'm going to use the dreadful word that I hate using, peat has terroir. You know, the peat on Orkney, where you were for quite a while, is completely different to the peat on the mainland of Scotland. Peat in the mainland of Scotland is completely different to the peat on Islay. Tasmanian peat is different to, again, you know, Washington State peat is different again, because the fauna, the flora of thousands of years ago was different. So on the mainland, you've got more lignin coming in, so you've got more wood coming through, so you get more of a wood smoke character coming in. It's more bonfire-like. So that's the other thing to look at. You know, is it what kind of smokiness is coming across?
Well, actually, as we're smelling this peated sample, maybe you could tell us, Alistair, a bit about the peat. I'm right in assuming we're using Highland peat when it comes to ours.
We do, and that's the very point that Dave made. So we're looking for more of that kind of wood smoke, more of that fragrant aromatic smoke. So we get Highland mainland peat, and you know, that's a purposeful choice. And again, you know, designing the distillery, you know, talking about the style of whiskey we wanted to make. You know, we latched on this Hebridean. What's Hebridean? Well, Islay is part of the Hebrides, but it's got a very clear heavily peated, but Islay peat, which is it's got all those kind of burnt rubber, plastic, iodine type characteristics, and that's not where we were going. And you know, I've used the word several times now, but we wanted more of an elegant peat, and I think that's where we are. We've got this Highland peat, more of a wood smoke. We'll see how that interacts with different casks, because it changes with the different casks, but very aromatic, I think, very sort of more floral and
absolutely. And I find this fascinating. You know, we're on the rye, you know, and comparing that to the unpeated rye. You know, You know, one thing, always never just finish your glass, because you always kind of compare and contrast. You know, that kind of intense peppery thing, which you're getting on the unpeated, is more muted here because the smoke's coming out. But it seems to have softened it as well.
Yeah.
You know, which is, you would expect it to actually magnify and actually become, you know, this huge roiling mass of smoke and pepper and everything. But it's actually very, very well balanced, actually.
Yeah, I think there's a question that came up actually a while back, which it relates actually to the bottle, but I think it's quite nice when we're talking about peat and the island and where things are drawn from and the influence of the place. And it was actually a question about the bottle. Somebody said, and I'm reading it out here, first time pouring from the most tactile and beautiful bottle in the history of Scotch whisky. Now, it's saying a lot, and I like what you're saying. Callum, can you talk about the inspiration and the design of the bottle? And I think it ties into some of the things that we're talking about, that idea of, you know, we're talking about the island's influence and the culture of the island and various things too. And if anyone has their bottle in front of them, obviously see ours here, you can see the rock layers and the crenellations and the shapes that are actually built into the bottle itself. Myself and my colleague Aileen, who's through there answering your questions in the chat, we actually had a hand in designing some of these shapes that came out of it. We actually took clay molds from around Raasay, took them directly from along Calms Road, very famous part of Raasay's history, from ammonites and fossil layers. There was actually a wee boy and his sister who collected a bunch of fossils that we then borrowed and had them sent away and 3D scanned into the design of the bottle and things too. And I think it was just, it's a good time maybe to kind of highlight that all of these things coming together is important in, you know, our whiskey, but we also wanted something that felt like you were really holding a piece of the island, contained in it the whiskey and the spirit from the bottle itself. And if you are drinking this at home, same with your cask samples, the first time that it's actually left the island is when it's basically being shipped out to your home or wherever you're getting it from. But it was a question that came up, and I think it was just quite nice to talk about as we were talking about the influence of the island and drawing from the ground as well.
But yes, it's absolutely fantastic. You know, again, when you add the water to it, it just opens up. The fruit is there. There's a slight kind of, it's not even, it's salty, is it? There's a kind of minerality to it on the finish, which is really interesting.
And I think it's that, as you said, that the wood smoke and the pepper is actually complementing each other rather than fighting with each other, and the water brings that out. And for me, if you compare this, the peated spirit, and we were talking about the legs and the oiliness, if you look at the peated, it's much more viscous than the unpeated. So
the mouthfeel is completely different, and you know, it's that recycling that you're getting, which, you know, will help to promote that wonderful kind of oily texture and that kind of tongue clinging quality.
Well, that goes back to what you were talking about mouthfeel and about the feel of the spirit, and something you mentioned there about fermentation times and developing the spirit. Is there, are we treating these two spirits differently in any other way? You know, we're obviously distilling one which is heavily peated, one which is unpeated, but in the distillation process, you kind of highlighted the line arm, but the fermentation, the mashing and the distillation, what kind of things are we doing to change it and define the two?
So we've got, again, you know, when we designed Distillery, we wanted to have things that could be off or on, and by being off or on, they just change things slightly. So we mentioned the cooling jackets on the washbacks, which could be off or on. So if we were on peated, using peated barley, we'd probably have them off, let the temperatures go a little bit higher, see that builds up more fusel oils in the actual wash itself. And then the cooling jacket on the line arm can be off or on. We tend to have it on when we're unpeated, and as you say, you build up that look, you build up the heavier, more viscous, and more of the phenolic characteristic as well. And then on the spirit still, we have a slightly inclined line arm, but before it goes into condenser, we have a set of valves and we can divert it. And we've also got a little 6-plate purifier. And I think it was yourself, Dave, that described it perhaps as a deconstructed Carter head still.
That's been stuck in my head for 3 years now.
So if you imagine taking this 6-plate purifier and taking the swan neck off the still and sitting it on the top, you've actually got a Carter head still or a Lowman still, which obviously at distilleries like Lowman you do have, and there's plates in there. So what that does is yes, it's more copper, it takes more impurities out, but it actually almost polishes the spirit, and you get a real focus into that blackcurrant note. But we haven't got it on top of the still, we've got it off to the side, so it can be off or on. So it gives us the option if we want to develop more particularly of that blackcurrant note. So these are things that we do differently, and as we said, we change the cut points when we're doing the cut on the peated as well.
Yeah, it's something again that we can cut to our ghostly forms floating in the distillery. But for those who are wondering, there's Alistair sitting in the centre of the stills, but up above there you can see the line arm, and of course the actual purifier on the top there too. The purifier being the cooling jacket, which can you're again floating in the.
So just here, this is where it collects. The pipe runs down into the distillery.
Yeah, it's like I say, it's not the cleanest way of showing off the interior of the distillery, but it is, I think, a good point that in the distillery, like you mentioned, there's a great way of being able to breed complexity or make changes to the spirit at every part in the process. And like we've talked about before, we always focus on stills, but you know, things like the washbacks, that we can take our Raasay water, pump around them, keep them cool, allow us to moderate, you know, fermentation times and temperatures, which I think is one of the things that, again, sometimes we can easily skip over, but is a really important part of the process as well. And again, I just want to say, really great feedback on this. It's really fun as we get into the peated stuff and we talk about what folks are experiencing with the smoke and the peat. I think the rye has been really interesting. People are really enjoying these. There is, I think, a lot of chat as well about how they're quite surprised that despite it being heavily peated, it does not come across as overwhelming. There's quite a nice balance between the two.
Well. And I think that it's a really good point that people are making there, and I think it's so important. You know, when you're tasting a peated whiskey, obviously you're going to get smoke, and you kind of register what the smoke is. But what you should always be looking for is sweetness, because sweetness gives balance. Because smoke is dry. You know, and if all you're getting is smoke, it's going to be really one-dimensional. So you always have to have that balancing sweetness, again, pretty much in the middle of the tongue, and that's got it. You know, and it's not just coming from the cask; it's there. It's there in the new make. You know, and that is absolutely vitally important.
There was another question that came in there by Tomas, which is what distillery is the condenser? So is it condenser type used in the distillery? The condenser being, of course, what we're using to cool the spirit as it comes off the stills. And is it maybe something you want to? Yeah,
I mean, we've got shell and tube condensers. It's quite interesting when you go into the distillery and you look at the two condensers. You look at the condenser for the wash still and the condenser for the spirit still. If you look closely, you'll actually notice that the condenser on the wash still is smaller than the condenser on the spirit still. Now that's really unusual because our wash still is 5,000 litre wash still, and our spirit still is 3,600 litres. So you would expect the other way around. But the load is factored in to the cooling jacket on the top. So when the cooling jacket's on the top, it balances the duty of the condenser, the shell and tube. However, we also have two subcoolers. So we have a closed loop system, so that the cooling system's closed, which means we can reduce the amount of water that we use. We have a cooling tower, and the cooling tower was very effective up to about 18 degrees C as an outside temperature. And believe it or not, it actually does get over 18 degrees on Raasay occasionally. Certainly in this room. So what we do is that's when the subcoolers kick in. And the rationale for that is that the spirit character changes if it goes over 20 degrees C. So again, back to designing the distillery, we put these subcoolers in to stop the spirit ever going over 20 degrees C, because we want to have control. So if we are focusing on particular elements, we don't then want to go, oh, well, it was hot, and so the spirit character is different. We actually want to. So we've got these little subcoolers. So subcoolers just like a little heat exchanger. So a long answer to a short question. Shell and tube. Something a lot of people were asking about, though. And I think actually a good point to move on maybe to our next dram as well, too. What we're going to be tasting next is the virgin Chinkapin oak. Again, same order as we've been doing it.
This time, of course, the peated version. And really interested to hear what folks think about this. Again, I've done a lot of these tastings. I've tended to find that this is quite a firm favourite amongst folks. Also interested to hear, and maybe hear you guys' thoughts on this. We should talk a little bit about maturation as we go on, and how we do it here on Raasay. But also when it comes to smoke and to peat, are you guys looking out for it? Do you think you're going to notice different amounts or different varieties or characteristics in the smoke just because of the cask type? Or is that going to be more, you know, something that varies more just with the barley?
No, absolutely. The smoke, the peat interacts completely differently with these different cask types. And again, you know, that was part of having these particular types of wood. And with the Chinkapin, I'm going to let Dave describe it because I absolutely love the description he uses with this, but it actually, the way the smoke works with the Chinkapin cask is quite unique, I think.
Yeah, I'm back in my American diner again. You know, I don't know if there's any Americans watching, but you know, Americans and Canadians indeed have this kind of slightly odd habit of pouring maple syrup on top of bacon, and it's in this glass box, you know. So you get that kind of frazzles bacon bits, maple syrup, and fried banana, which I think is a very Glaswegian thing. But, you know,
I'm amazed. Scott Fraser, who's one of our sales team, is probably going absolutely wild in the next room because in a virtual tasting somebody said frazzles once, and I roasted him for it in the tasting. So Scott, vindicated. I will say vindication through there. But yeah, I think that's another one that's always stuck in my head. That idea of the virgin Chinkapin oak casks not being an American diner even as much in flavor, in style. You know, they're loud and they're humorous and they're boisterous, and it's all up front. It's all energy. And then when you go into the peat, you're suddenly adding smoke. You're adding bacon bits onto the top of that maple syrup and stuff. I think it's so evocative, and it's like you've said through this whole tasting. It's not just about the literal taste, the literal smell. It's the feel and
and you know, there's more to a smoky whiskey than smoke. You know, I think that's an important thing. You know, smoke is an element within it. And it might be a defining element within it, but it's not the only thing that is happening. And then as soon as you're going to put that in different casks, I mean, look at the different way in which that smoke manifests itself on the palate compared to the rye. You know, I mean, it's unbelievable. You know, completely different. You don't get any of that bacon, you know, it's like meatiness coming through.
The other description that people have used when we've done the tastings for this is kind of barbecued. Spare ribs, and it's got that kind of sticky mouthfeel to it as well.
There's John saying it smells like an IHOP restaurant, which is a very American restaurant. I would like to hear, if you're in the chat, I'd love to hear where everyone's tuning in from. I think the most exotic we ever got was Greenland. I don't think I've ever had anyone since, but I'd love to hear where everyone's tuning in from as well. But yeah, really great. The color of the Chinkapin after 34 months is amazing, says Roy. And I think that's maybe a good point to talk about. Maturation. Now, obviously, these casks are maturing in the same way and at the same rate, and we've discussed why these are developing differently. But maybe, Alistair, you could expand a bit on how we mature here on the Isle of Raasay.
Yeah, so we've got two different styles of warehouses. We've got a palletized warehouse and we have a dunnage warehouse. And it's an absolute proper dunnage warehouse, earth floors. And the rationale behind that is that the palletized warehouse is absolutely the best use of space. So we can get a lot of casks in a palletized warehouse. However, the downside with a palletized warehouse is that it is potential for the ends of the cask to dry out, and you can get more leaking. And the other thing is, it's particularly nice is to always have the spirit in contact with both ends of the cask. So we have our dunnage warehouse, and we use our dunnage warehouse for those casks that we've selected that are going to be aged on. So something that's going to be older would be in the dunnage warehouse. But some of the more, shall we say, interesting casks. We won't say too much about it. But and also for those people who have supported us and bought casks, you know, to have people who own casks, to have them in the dunnage warehouse, so they're accessible. So when people come, they can go to their cask and they can actually sample.
And it could be different rates of maturation as well.
I think it will be
slightly faster and palletized and slower in dunnage, maybe, you know.
Maybe in time, and you know, we're only just, as we said, we're only just bottling. You know, this vatting that we've done will be about 27,000 bottles. So we're really just getting to grips to what our evaporation is on Raasay and how that varies from the dunnage to the palletized, and is there more at the you know, on the pallets at the top
Yes.
of the warehouse. You know,
Yes.
so
Yes.
we've got all of this just to work through it. But I think, you know, Angel shares one thing, but having that differential actually changes the rate of maturation as well.
And someone, Norbert asks there, are you moving casks from one warehouse to the other in the process of maturing? Yeah, or are they staying relatively static?
It's generally speaking, they're fairly static. Having said that, our original maturation warehouse is behind the distillery, and we've now converted that into our cask filling and bottling. So, you know, all of the bottling is actually done on site at the distillery. But those casks did have to be moved down to the new warehouses. And Callum, I think you've got a particularly interesting video of the casks going into the warehouse. Nice. So to answer Norbert's question, not necessarily part of the maturation regime.
Yeah.
But it is true that we did actually move all those casks about a mile down the road to the new warehouse.
Yeah, we had roughly I can't remember the final stat, but we did have, you know, close to a couple thousand casks all stored in one single warehouse for a while. Everything being matured in the one place. And if you go to our YouTube channel, I'll actually post it in the chat. The video of us moving the casks and transferring them to our new warehouse. But, you know, it was something that was so important. It's one of the things that always really solidified in my mind the commitment of the distillery to the island, because, you know, being able to say that we have done this entire process from start to finish, it's not necessarily taken the easy route. I think maybe people would assume, oh, well, obviously keeping them down the road's easier than not. But, you know, we could have gone through a lot of different potential ways of doing this that didn't involve 100% of this maturation in Raasay. And it's always something that I've been really proud of when it comes to our whiskey. I think it's drinking it a lot more enjoyable to me.
Yeah, picking up on that point, Cam, it's a really good one. That we're at the start of Scotch whisky 2.0, if you want to call it. You know, really since the late 19th century up until probably only about 10 years ago, single malt distilleries were there at the service of blends, and quite right too, because blended whiskey is absolutely fantastic, it's brilliant, and it was selling, you know, it was 95% of Scotch whisky sold. So distilleries were set up to produce a specific distillery character that the blenders could use. Now single malt is far more important, and new distilleries are appearing, and they're not beholden to the blending houses. Therefore, to make themselves attractive, to actually make a statement, to be able to cut through, because there's more whiskey around than you know at any point in whiskey's history, you've got to start looking deeper. You know, so that paradigm has shifted completely, and the new wave of distilleries coming out, and the ones which are successful and will continue to be successful, such as Raasay, are taking that extra step and making life deliberately difficult for themselves, you know, and being iconoclastic and weird, and trying out new oaks and testing. You know, people often complain about, you know, the Scotch whisky regulations and blah, blah, blah. There's a huge amount of flex in the Scotch whisky regulations. It's just that the industry hasn't really taken advantage of the points of flex which actually do exist. You can use different yeasts, you can use different types of oak, you can do this, you can do that, you can play with distillation. And that's what's exciting, I think, about Raasay. One of the great, really exciting things about it is it has a beacon for a new way of thinking about whiskey making. That it's not just cookie cutter. No, you know, it's not just, you know, there's an awful lot of kind of vanilla whiskey out there, you know, or kind of beige whiskey rather than vanilla. You know, that it all kind of tastes the same. It's nice, but it's easy to make nice whiskey. You should be wanting to make great whiskey, you know. But then to make great whiskey, you've got to take that extra step, or 2 steps, or 3 steps, and yeah, that's what's happening here.
Someone actually asked as well, Alistair, you know, is the plan to hold cask and bottle on Raasay in the future? Is that something that we're just doing now, or is that the plan going forward?
No, I think it's fair to say that is the plan for now, and that is the plan for the medium term. And you never say never, but I think it's a huge thing for us. When we built the 2 new warehouses, you know, Norman did all the groundworks for the 3rd warehouse, so there is room for another warehouse. So, you know, we've thought about that, we've built it in, we've literally expanded and converted the original warehouse for bottling. It's going to have offices. We can expand that bottling capacity. You know, we were joking earlier about the fact that we're still bottling this single lease, but we are still bottling the single lease. There's a lot we could do with more automation and all the rest of it. So no, I think very much that's the plan.
Yeah, I think one of the things that was most fascinating to me, I mean, most of us that work here on Raasay in the distillery are doing this for the first time. You know, we've come in here, we've learned the skills. You know, I personally worked at sea and I've moved back to do this, and a lot of the operators are the same. You know, they've been working in different industries and moved back to the island for the opportunity to live here and to work at the distillery. So one of the most fascinating things for me was seeing the disgorging of the casks, the actual process of opening the casks up, rolling them onto the trough, and then disgorging them. And like I say, Ghost of Christmas Past will now fly up. This is your life, Alistair. You can see casks being rolled and disgorged here. You can see spirit being emptied out of the casks. You're in the splash zone, Alistair. But it's quite fascinating seeing the difference, the distinction, the crispness.
Yeah, I mean, look at that. I mean, we talk about our cask being highly charred. There is an example of our cask being highly charred. When you empty them, we filled that trough with charcoal. Yeah, I mean, those heavy toast, heavy char casks are obviously floating with charcoal, but all of them, you're grabbing the literal handfuls of charcoal itself. And to folks who are at home, you may notice especially I think in the virgin Chinkapin oak casks, you'll see that charcoal flow. Yeah. What effect does that have when it comes to the actual whiskey, the charcoal? So the charcoal is really important. You know, we've talked about the influence of the oak and the different oak species and the flavors it brings, but the charcoal is really important because it actually acts as a filter, and it takes the impurities out. You know, all the way through the process, we're thinking about that, and that's the purpose of copper in the stills, to take out impurities. But the high char, you know, we said earlier why we high char this. It increases the surface area. It allows the spirit to get further into the oak, but it also gives more, if you like, purity to the whiskey.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a cooker hood, you know, which is packed full of activated charcoal to remove smells of cabbage and stuff. and cabbage is sulfur, you know. And, you know, not that your name has sulfur in it, but it's a natural byproduct of whiskey. So yeah, it's essentially a filtration system. Yeah, because there's three things that happen in maturation. There's that subtractive stuff, which is taking away all the impurities that you don't want, the aggression that you don't want, and that's been done by the char. And then there's additive stuff, which is all the flavors from the wood coming in to meet the spirit. And then there's the magic of that interaction between the flavors of the new make and the flavors from the oak working together to produce something new. So, you know, new flavors, tertiary flavors. So, you know, those three elements are coming, and depending how fresh the cask is, that's going to be rapid or it's going to be slower. You know, so there's lots of tunes that you can play with.
The whiskey and single malts are such a fractal. The closer you look, it just spirals off in 100 different directions. You can never truly pin down the end point of one of these things.
And nobody ever will ever know everything about whiskey. You know, and that's why it's fascinating, because every glass you learn something new.
There's a quote for the book. Well, on that note, exactly. What a perfect segue. Well, what we'll do is we'll actually go on to excitingly our final of the night. Now, obviously, I'm not going to recommend everyone keeps pouring more drams, but after this, what we might do is we might finish on our single malt again, just kind of tie it all up. But we're on the last of our cask samples, which of course is the peated Ex-Bordeaux red wine casks. As we've already seen, you know, there is a really beautiful variation in these casks. Again, this is something that my colleague and I, Scott, in our virtual tastings have found, is that the difference between the peated Bordeaux and the unpeated Bordeaux is, I find, quite distinct, compared perhaps to the other peated and unpeated examples. Now, we also have a fair few questions that have come in, so we'll have a taste of this, try it. We'll go through some of these questions as well too. But again, Dave, I'd like to hear your impressions of this. Again, a cask that, as we talked about the first one, has probably developed quite a lot just in the past few months.
Yeah, I mean, again, the colour's actually, it's much deeper than
absolutely
the unpeated. You know, it's much more active cask.
Yeah, it's almost a rusty brown.
The smoke is there again after that Chinkapin. Going back here, there's much more of a clear wood smoke character coming through. You know, so it's got that, but it's that kind of scented wood. You know, so if you're throwing cherry wood or whatever onto a bonfire, it's got that wonderful kind of aromatic quality to it. I'm getting more of the fruits coming through. So I think your dark fruits are coming through here. And the smoke is just kind of playing with it, you know, it's teasing you. On the palate, the smoke's quite upfront, you know, it's really coming in, but the sweetness is there.
Yeah.
You know, so initially you kind of go, whoa, lots of smoke, and then suddenly, wait, hang on a minute.
Yeah.
Here comes the fruit, here comes a lovely citric element. You know, towards the end, you get that acidity that I was talking about, that brightness coming through in the finish. Because quite normally, you know, a smoky whiskey will start with the fruits, get sweet in the middle, and then the smoke will come flooding in at the back.
Yeah,
this is almost reverse. You know, the smoke is there, and then the fruits are coming, and then the smoke actually begins to sneak back in at the very end. It's almost the reverse of what you would normally anticipate, but real layers of complexity coming through here.
It's quite interesting, I think, the way the smoke manifests in different casks. I've always found that the Bordeaux cask maybe to be a little bit of a drier wood smoke, whereas, you know, other casks maybe are a little bit more meaty, a bit more juicy. So it's quite fascinating, like I say, again, seeing how these casks develop, but seeing the way that the cask influences that peat effect that we were talking about.
The sensation is very similar to, you know, if you've been out camping and you smell your clothes the day after. You know, that lingering, that wonderful lingering wood smoke that you get. That's what it's kind of reminding me of.
And I think this is the one cask for me, you know, with the peated spirit and the Bordeaux red wine, where I get that salty, almost slightly maritime note on it.
It's West Coast, you know.
Yeah, it's absolutely West Coast, and it's the Bordeaux. It's the French oak that I think is bringing that kind of like saltiness.
Yeah, David. I think
because you often get that tightness coming from smoke, which is a brilliant thing.
Yeah,
and I mean that kind of minerality, that saltiness, which just picked up earlier on, much more, indeed, much more apparent. Yeah,
a lot of good reactions to this. Julia Smith, sweet woody smoke, but you can still get the red wine cask in there. Yeah. So not, you know, clearly again that idea that it's not being overwhelmed in any way. I Callum Kate, nice mention there, like drowning in a vat of smoky blackcurrant jam, but in a nice way. So I think that's a very good way of summing it up, isn't it? It's very overwhelming, but in a nice way. But someone mentioned, in fact, Steve Atkiss, who I believe actually visited the distillery and did a tour here a few days ago. Hello, Steve. Peated Bordeaux is a beautiful whiskey. A few years on, and this dram will be a dream. Quite interesting as well. One of the other comments on the Chinkapin had talked about how it feels very much mature and would be an amazing dram today. And it's something, you know, how are these casks going to, they're not all aging or maturing at the same rate, obviously, but what are you looking for in the next couple of years when it comes to these three different cask types?
So the Bordeaux red wine cask and the rye cask are going to mature. I mean, they're very active casks, but they're going to develop, and I think Steve's absolutely right. That Bordeaux red wine, that French oak, is just going to develop and develop and develop. And I think it's exactly the same with the rye, but it will probably bring more of the quercetin, more of the butterscotch, more of the vanilla. The one that we've got to watch is the Chinkapin. We will be emptying those and refilling. Right. We'll be emptying and refilling, but there will always be, I think, an element of the virgin cask in there. I also noticed on the comment someone had asked about the ratio of unpeated to peated spirit, and it's worth saying it is 50-50. Right. So you know, when we say we do 6 months a year of unpeated, 6 months, it's vatted in that proportion as well. So it's half unpeated and half peated.
So it's that, so when we're talking about a predominant base of rye, that body of virgin oak, and then the seasoning on the top of Bordeaux, all of that is split 50-50 between peated and unpeated. Right. In fact, a few people had asked that as well. You know, Richard Day, roughly, what is the proportion of peated to unpeated?
Hi, Dad.
In the final I was going to say a Richard Day, probably a name you would recognise. He's got all the talking points there to be an audience plan. But actually, Kyle asks a question which goes back a little bit, but Kyle says, was there a rationale behind choosing stainless steel washbacks versus the more traditional Oregon?
Absolutely.
Because there's Alistair sitting amongst
right in the middle, looking very comfortable in between the stainless steel.
But it's a good point. We do have obviously stainless steel. I had mentioned that they can be utilized for cooling, but he says, I know that they typically state the washback doesn't impart flavor to the whiskey, but I do feel that pine washbacks add the subtlest character change. What's
so quite honestly, my background, I worked for 25-30 years in the food industry. and cleaning is absolutely paramount. And I have a different view on. I think the Douglas fir, absolutely things of wonderful beauty, but you wouldn't want to be asked to be cleaning them terribly often. And so yes, I think it might lend something to flavour, but it's not oak. You know, if there were oak washbacks, okay, we're only in there 5 days. So I think for me, stainless steel, long fermentations, you still get that lactobacillus development. You're still getting the environmental input in stainless steel. I think there's a bit of romanticism around oak, Douglas fir washbacks. However, I hope tasting our whiskey tonight serves a case for stainless steel.
Well, yeah, well, I mean, quite interesting, Norbert there, who I believe already given us some really good questions and comments, says all the spirits leave the impression of them being older than they are. And I think, you know, obviously you said it in the past yourself, you know, you can't beat maturation, but I think it'd be quite interesting to hear you guys' thoughts. I do sometimes feel that these spirits do sometimes really, people go into these expecting cask samples, which often maybe people are a bit wary of because they are very rough, sometimes very strong. But I think these are remarkably palatable, especially having tasted it now against a 46% single malt. So is that something you guys have noticed with these samples?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, you know, age is a number, maturity is a character. You know, don't get hung up on age, because, you know, if any of these were in, you know, fifth fill rye cask at the same age, you would go, oh, that's really immature. You know, a more active cask is going to push it along that arc of maturity quicker. So our dear friend Joe talks about, you know, so it's to do with the cask, you know, it's to do with the cask and to do with the environment. It's not, don't get hung up on numbers. So yes, they do taste older, but actually they taste more mature. You know, it's probably a better way of putting it. You know, I'm not kind of, it sounds like I'm splitting hairs and being ridiculous, semantic, but as soon as you kind of free yourself from that, that obsession with numbers and think in terms of maturity, suddenly a new world of flavour begins to open up.
And I think it's absolutely right to say that we can't change the aging process. You know, the aging process takes time. It's a chemical reaction between the spirit and the oak, and it takes a long time for those bigger lignans and those bigger molecules to break down into those flavour compounds that we taste, and that's the maturity we talk about. But what I think we've done is we've said, well, what you can do, if you think about it differently, is you can define the flavours that you want and introduce them in a different way. So by having 2 different spirit types, 3 different oak types, by having active casks and first fill casks and very different flavours, so peppery, mellowness from the Chinkapin, dark fruits from the Chinkapin, dark fruits from the wine, but then the kind of savoury spice from the French oak, and layering it all together. That's how I think we can get the complexity and depth at a younger maturation.
Yeah, definitely. I think you know, we've now gotten to the end of all of our cask samples, and we're still all standing. Hopefully, you are sitting, heavily sitting. But I think it's been really fascinating for me as well, being able to taste again the single malt. One thing that I hadn't mentioned that I think is always really important is that we've obviously had a chance to try the single malt, but we only ever got a chance to try it in small batches, developing cask samples. So the first time that we got a chance to try it was when a lot of it was going out to folks and people were trying it down here at the distillery. So it's been amazing actually being able to witness the development of these casks and then taste the single malt. Now, one thing I didn't mention, I did talk about the fact that we are doing polls, that we are going to be asking for your favorites, seeing what your kind of favorites are. I'm going to do the same. I'm going to give you a poll now of what you consider to be the best of the peated. Now, maybe Alistair, you could expand on that a bit yourself, but we are planning on doing a single cask release. And I think we're planning is whoever or whichever cask sample you choose in this poll of the peated samples is what we will release as our first of the single cask releases. And it's a question people have asked, are we planning on making single cask releases of these samples?
So we are. So we're going to do the 3 peated casks that we taste tonight will be bottled as single cask bottlings. But what we thought would be really nice is to ask everyone tonight which is their favourite, and we will pick that cask type, and we will bottle that first ahead of the other 2. It is only going to be a distillery exclusive. It's only going to be available in the distillery shop and through a ballot online. But tonight, everyone has the option to decide which cask we're going to bottle
The
first.
choice is in your hands.
Over to you.
Yeah, so like Alistair mentioned, this is going to be a distillery exclusive, and it's the same with our single malt and the fact that it's available in our shop here on site. We like to reward folks who come up to Raasay as well, the ability to buy a bottle, and we're going to be doing the same and having this available in the shop here, and also, like we mentioned, as a ballot online. Now, if you are interested in that, I'd recommend you go to our website. There's the Slange Club, which is our newsletter. We can maybe post that in the chat, and that way we can get that out to you guys. But essentially sign up to that and you'll have the first chance to kind of enter your name into this ballot. So what I'm going to do, same as we did before, we're going to put the poll live. We're going to be watching this ourselves, and maybe again I'll ask these guys what their favorites are, and hopefully it won't influence things too much. But your favorite peated samples, and like I say, the winner will decide what our very first of the single cask releases will be. So I'm just launching the poll now. The votes are hopefully rolling in. Is there one? I'm going to hide this. Is there, in your heart of hearts, is there one that you're hoping maybe that you'd be interested to taste as a single cask release? Would you imagine we'd be doing these at cask strength in the bottle, or?
Yeah, I think there'll be cask strength.
Yeah.
Both lines. I think proper, if you like, proper single cask bottling. However, for me, which would you do? Which would you?
I'm just going to tell you now. My favorite would be Rye, and I know that because it's not going to win. And I'll tell you right now, it is currently a battle.
Neck and neck.
It is, guys. It's literally neck and neck. So keep voting because this is quite remarkable seeing it go up and up. But Dave, yourself, if you had
more exciting than Eurovision.
Mille fois for Rye whiskey, it seems. But, David, in your heart, is there one that you would love to walk away from today with in a bottle?
I mean, it's so close. I do love the Rye. I love them all. Tonight,
I'm going
to be a Bordeaux red. I just think that just had that extra level of complexity.
It's interesting as well because I do think in the early days the Bordeaux was the one that was just the more controversial. I just don't think it was coming up as much in the polls that we'd done. And to me, I think I would say the same. I love the Rye, but the way the Bordeaux has been developing is fascinating. Now 84% have voted. So like I say, you've got it's literally there's one vote in it right now. So I'm just going to say I'm going to
get voting.
I'm going to leave it open at 30 more seconds. This is we are currently at 43%, 43%. So there's literally one vote.
How influential is a whiskey writer? Yeah, there we go.
But what I will say is, we're actually literally neck and neck right now. So I will say we need one more vote potentially. Okay. But I think it's quite amazing when you see, like, say, the way that these have been developing. And we've talked about the ones that are our favorite. Is there one that you think is going to be interesting in the next few months, years? Is there any of these that stick out in particular?
Yeah, I mean, we've said it already. The Bordeaux and the French oak is the one that's going to just develop. And I think for most people, the peated, certainly in the virtual tastings, that for most people, the peated Chinkapin has been the revelation, the one that's made them actually go, wow, that's something. But maybe talking tonight about how things have developed and how it have changed might just have influenced this vote. So
it's always good to see. Well, I'll tell you what, the voting has closed. And I will share the results with you. I can now say, and I will tell you right now, there was one vote in it. One single vote swayed this, which is, and Dave, you saw him on camera. He did not run off camera to vote. But I'll tell you right now that the Bordeaux red wine, peated, has won the poll, and that will be our very first single cask release. So it will look maybe a little bit like this.
It will look a lot like that
in the bottle. This was actually something somebody asked a couple of times right at the start, which is a good question because it actually has quite a similar color, and that's people that were asking, what is the difference between this release, the Isle of Raasay single malt, and the inaugural Isle of Raasay single malt? I'm sure a few people have this at home. Yeah. We've got a few questions coming about it. So briefly, what is the difference between?
So the inaugural release was purposely very different. The inaugural release was a one-off. It's something we were only going to do once. For me, personally, it was a link from While We Wait to the single malt that we've launched tonight. And it was produced in a slightly different way. So it was matured for 2 years in Tennessee whiskey cask, Jack Daniel cask. And then for the last year, for the third year, we took it out of those casks and we put it into Bordeaux red wine cask for that last year. So with just a year in the red wine cask, the Bordeaux wine was very much more forward. So yes, you had that kind of typical, if you like, bourbon characteristic, even though it's a Tennessee sour mash whiskey, but you had that kind of sweet butterscotchy vanilla, and then layered over the top was this dark fruit and the black grape. So really quite different from what we're doing tonight. And I think for me, anyway, the whiskey, the actual Isle of Raasay single malt that we've launched tonight has the layers, it has the complexity, it has the depth, it has the elegance. The inaugural release, absolutely fantastic. And just wanted to join the dots from the journey from 2015 when we launched 1208 to launching our first single malt, tying it all together, and then actually launching a single malt proper.
It was a lovely bridge.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where I know a lot of people are always very interested in the inaugural release, but to me, this is the thing, we've always had this date in the diary for when it was ready. This has been the aim when we've been watching these casks getting laid down and this recipe coming together. This is what it's been all about, you know, and that's why I'm always so excited now seeing people opening it, pouring it, drinking it. That's, you know, it still is remarkable to me. I do a lot of the photography here, and I had one bottle of this and that was it to do all of the photography. And now I get so precious when I see these being opened and poured out and people putting the bottles and recycling. It's mad to me. It's amazing that we're actually here. And I think, you know, we're getting to the end of the night. What I'm going to do is, I think what we should do, we'll pour one final dram of of all the round of samples. We'll pour the Isle of Raasay single malt. I encourage you again to do it at home. We'll have our final toast. If you've got any final questions as well, quick fire questions, feel free to submit them in the Q&A or the chat there, and we'll see if there was any that we missed. I hope I've managed to kind of get through everything tonight as well. But yeah, we'll have one last dram to see us as well. I think a lot of really good reactions to the Bordeaux, I will say as well. I think Callum and Kate thank Dave Broom for swaying the vote potentially. I won't say there's no funny business, just opinions being shared. Yeah, really, really, really fascinating. But yeah, so our final dram of the night. I hope everyone else has theirs out now, and also do take note of this. I mean, the nosing, the tasting, the sampling, because you've now had a chance to go through all of these. I think it's really nice to actually revisit this. For me, spice and pepper are always at that forefront, the rye, but I feel like I'm picking up a lot more of the virgin oak, a lot more of the Bordeaux as we've discussed it, you know.
I think the mellowness, having tried each individual element of the whiskey, when you go back to it, and I've gone back to mine early one that I had added water to, and that mellowness that's in there, and it's just, as you say, the mouthfeel, the smoothness, but also, as Callum said, you've definitely got that spice and pepper. It's still there. You've got the dark fruits, but they're kind of that middle ground there, which is all the Chinkapin oak cask. But I think it's lovely, fantastic that we've got the Bordeaux, Peated Bordeaux to do our first single cask bottling with. And again, in this, it's just floating across the top. It's just that top note.
Yeah, definitely. And there are actually a number of really good little quick fire questions that are coming in as well too. Colours are amazing. Rachel L says, and she's saying it's all natural colour. I'm assuming
absolutely all natural colour.
Yeah.
Straight out the cask.
It does say on our bottle, actually, if you've actually got your bottle in front of you, you'll notice there's everything you could possibly want to know about the way the whiskey was made, but it does say non-chill filtered and caramel free, which means it is the no colouring in there. And if you were to add in another cask type, or you were looking at other casks in the future, is there any that are in that warehouse that you're interested in?
The reason I'm laughing rather loudly about that is that Dave and I were actually down in the warehouse this afternoon tasting some different casks, and we probably shouldn't mention them just yet. Maybe that's another...
Probably not yet,
but there's stuff.
But trust me, folks, there is some insanely wonderful things coming your way. Yeah, it's just mind-blowingly great.
Now there's that's a plug. That'll be Dave's face on the bottle.
But you're going to have to wait.
Well,
Absolutely.
A couple of questions that came in regarding kind of culture and island provenance that I think was quite interesting, and I want to lump them together for yourself, Dave, because you're actually working on a book right now that kind of touches on this. And we've talked a lot about the culture and the influence of the place, but maybe you could just talk a little bit about what it is you're working on and how you think kind of Raasay ties into that. I know that when you came here last year, you were also working on the book at the same time, and being down in the warehouse and tasting our samples. You visited Hallig, which, if anyone's unaware, very famous part in Raasay's history as well too. So yeah, is there anything you want to talk about?
Oh yeah, I mean, how long have you got?
Another hour.
So the book's called Sense of Place. It was due to come out this autumn, but something happened. So it's going to come out next year. We're finishing off the research, kind of from next month onwards. The idea of it really is to look at the story of whiskey in terms of place and community. The word terroir is, I think, overused in whiskey, and it's kind of trying to shoehorn wine speak and wine terroir into whiskey, which I don't think works. I prefer to look at this theory called bioregionalism. So a bioregional examination of a landscape involves the people. So it's not just the geology which creates the flora, which then encourages fauna, which then gives food, and people come in. It's actually looking at all of that, all the kind of physical geography, but also the human influence on that and the cultural aspect within that. And that is, for me, one of the things that tends to be overlooked in whiskey is that it's a cultural product. It's an agricultural product, which we've tended to forget, but it's a cultural product as well. And it's at the heart of communities. So by traveling kind of from north to south in Scotland and picking out a few distilleries, it's fascinating to see how those areas have changed and altered, and how the influence of whiskey has changed those areas. And come to Raasay in particular was so important for me, because here's whiskey stimulating an island into life again. Yeah. When it was, whiskey used to be made all across the West Coast, all across the islands, and that was lost. In the commercial days of when whiskey came in, beginning of the 19th century, that old tradition, that Gaelic tradition of whiskey making disappeared completely, and a Gaelic tradition of thinking about whiskey and thinking about landscape was lost as well, and you got kind of romantic ideas imposed upon what Scotland was. Which since got really kind of big picture. But you've got to think about whiskey as being a representation of place and the way in which it affects and influences a community. Because as soon as you put a distillery here, more people are going to be coming across. People are going to be coming back because there's employment, such as yourself. People are coming across and they're going to need something to eat. So all of a sudden you've got ancillary, you've got, a sandwich shop opening up, and you've got jewelers opening up, and you've got a community coming back into life. And to be honest, you're seeing this across the West Coast. There's a number of other distilleries who have just arrived, and boom, all of a sudden you've got local people, young people, young kids coming in going, I can now stay where I want to stay. And whiskey always had that, and it lost it. So that's kind of what the book's about. The book is looking at place and people.
A good way. I think it's very relevant, I think, to a lot of the stuff we're talking about tonight. And I mean, it's myself, a lot of the folks that work here. It's the same thing. We grew up here, moved away. We are now back and able to work here as a result of this and the whiskey you're drinking. There's a reason I'm always so enthusiastic about this whiskey on tours, because it kind of represents all of that, and coming back to the island and being able to do this sort of stuff. Now, we've also got a lot of great feedback from the night. We've had a few questions that we'd answered over the course of the night as well. Casks, maturation. I think it was really good being able to get your guys' thoughts and interactions on the very first opening and tasting of the single malt and the cask samples too. So I really want to thank you guys for coming and doing this tasting and joining all of us here as well. If you are interested in more, you can go to our website, Isle of Raasay Distillery, or raasaydistillery.com. We have a lot of our products from the gin. Our whiskey at the moment was available on a ballot, but we do have it available here in the distillery too. I'd recommend you sign up for the Slange Club, the newsletter. That's where any news, especially the stuff about the single cask Bordeaux, is going to be coming out as well. And if you like to visit us here in the distillery, if you'd like to visit us here in the distillery, we have a hotel on site. We're one of the only distilleries in Scotland in which you can stay in the distillery. We do lock the distillery at night, unfortunately. But thanks again, everyone, for coming around. It's been really nice. If you've got any more questions, anything that you feel we haven't covered, you can feel free to get in contact with us. We have our email addresses through social media as well too. But been a really fantastic evening. I think we'll have a final toast to the night, and then we'll call it an evening. I think we've all had plenty of drams, but you can all celebrate with what you've got left as well. So yeah, thank you very much to everyone, and Slange to everybody as well. Cheers. Somebody saying there, can I sleep in the warehouse? No, you can't sleep in the warehouse. Not allowed. Thanks a lot, everyone. Thanks again. Good night. Cheers.